She sat quietly in her wheelchair, lost in a book, when a millionaire's bodyguard hurled her to the airport floor, clearing space for his boss's designer luggage. 40 people watched. Not one moved. Too afraid of the family's reach to open their mouths. None of them noticed the man in the corner, or the 90-pound military working dog resting at his feet. Within 8 seconds, this off-duty Navy SEAL would turn their world inside out, igniting a courtroom war that would reshape every life it touched. Drop a comment and tell us what country you're watching from. And if stories like these stay with you, hit subscribe to keep the channel going. The air inside Terminal 4 hung thick, recycled heavy with designer perfume, scorched espresso, and the stale nerves of 1,000 strangers. Most people dulled it out by staring at their phones. Mason couldn't do that. His nervous system wouldn't allow it. He occupied a corner seat in the boarding lounge, spine pressed against a concrete pillar. That position wasn't random. It was instinct. The quiet math of a man who'd spent years mapping exits and calculating threat angles before his coffee cooled. Active-duty Navy SEAL, a body stitched with scars, a mind that processed tactical data the way other people processed small talk. Lean frame, coiled with functional muscle that pressed against his plain gray t-shirt like bundled wire. A tactical cap sat low across his brow, blocking the harsh fluorescent flicker overhead, a frequency that buzzed in his teeth. Nobody else seemed to hear it. At his boots lay Atlas, 90 pounds of German Shepherd, coat the shade of toasted sable, eyes unsettlingly sharp. Atlas was no pet, multi-purpose canine, 3 deployments deep. His black tactical vest read, "Working dog, do not pet," in stark white letters. The dog's chin rested on Mason's heavy tan boot. But those ears never stopped moving, tracking every rolling suitcase, every overhead chime. Both of them were gutted from a training cycle that had dragged them well past the edge of failure. Still, exhaustion hadn't dulled them. They held that particular stillness, loose muscles, locked awareness, relaxed readiness, waiting on a flight back to base. A brief corridor between the chaos of the field and the order of the barracks. 15 feet from Mason, a large blue sign with the International Disability symbol marked the priority seating area. A small pocket of calm carved from airport madness. Sitting there was Irina, late 20s, quiet in a way that carried weight. Paralyzed from the waist down. Her wheelchair was high-tech, lightweight, fitted so precisely it looked less like equipment and more like part of her. A soft cream cardigan, a book open in her lap, her eyes steady across the pages. Something about her stillness caught Mason's attention, not fragility, but composure. A woman comfortable inside her own skin, regardless of what the world decided when it glanced her way. She didn't invite pity. She radiated the particular strength of someone who had survived her own kind of battlefield and walked, or rolled, out the other side remade. That stillness wasn't built to last. It didn't break with a scream or a crash. It broke with an arrival. The Sterling family didn't enter the lounge. They colonized it. Mr. Sterling came first, mid-50s, wearing a suit that cost more than a decent car. His face locked in a permanent scowl of rehearsed displeasure. Behind him, his wife floated in silk, clutching a designer handbag like royalty gripping a scepter. 2 teenage sons trailed after them, radiating the theatrical boredom of boys who'd never been denied anything. Their voices hit the terminal like an oil spill, spreading, smothering the low hum of the crowd. They moved without the faintest awareness of anyone around them. Or maybe they simply didn't care. The world was expected to part. This is ridiculous. Mr. Sterling's voice sliced through the lounge. Quote, _2 __. He surveyed the crowded seating area, face twisted with open contempt. His gaze settled on the priority zone. The blue sign was right there, bold, unmistakable. He either didn't see it or decided it didn't apply to him. What he saw was open space, and one woman in his way. A flick of the wrist toward Irina. Quote, _3 __. The 2 sons moved without hesitation. They crossed toward Irina with a kind of casual entitlement that made the hair on the back of Mason's neck prickle. The taller one, bleached hair, designer sweatshirt, swung an oversized leather duffel onto the empty seat beside Irina's wheelchair. Metal buckles cracked against plastic. He never once looked at her, just turned to his brother, grinning. Farina glanced up from her book. Calm, controlled. She closed the cover, one finger holding her page, and addressed the man who appeared to be their father. She said, voice clear and level. Mr. Sterling didn't break stride. He reached the zone and planted himself directly above her, crowding her space. He stood a full head taller, would have even if she'd been on her feet, and he wielded that height like a blade. Quote 7, he said. The tone was syrup-thick, patronizing, more cutting than any shout. Quote 8. Quote 9, Irina answered. Her voice held steady despite his looming frame. Quote 10. Quote, Mrs. Sterling stepped forward now. Her nose wrinkled, the expression of someone who'd encountered a bad smell. It's just a chair, dear. Can't you roll it a few feet that way? Honestly, the entitlement of people these days is staggering. We just want to sit down as a family. She waved loosely toward the packed corridor. I'm sure there's plenty of room to park somewhere else. Mason observed all of it from his pillar. His eyes narrowed to slits. He felt Atlas shift against his leg, the dog's muscles coiling tight as the tension climbed. Mason's hand found the dog's head, a silent hold, but his own pulse was quickening. He'd encountered this breed of behavior on every continent. The arrogance of people who treated their own comfort as a universal right, who regarded rules as inconveniences designed for someone else. I'm not moving, Irina said, and this time steel ran through the words like rebar through concrete. This area is reserved for a reason. Please move your bags. Mr. Sterling's expression shifted. The veneer of polite irritation cracked, revealing something far uglier beneath. He glanced at his sons, then back at Irina. Quote 15, quote, he said, voice dropping low. Quote 16, quote. He turned his back on her. Conversation over. As he pivoted, his heavy leather briefcase swung wide. It caught the wheel of her chair with a dull, metallic thud. Irina flinched. Her hands clamped down on the armrests. The sons piled more bags onto the surrounding seats, walling her in. They laughed, talked about plans at their destination, carrying on as if the human being 2 feet away were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. The tension hung in the air like something solid, a weight you could feel against your chest. Nearby travelers looked away, afraid of the confrontation building right in front of them. Mason did not look away. He rose slowly. Atlas rose with him, perfect, synchronized. Silent. The predator had surfaced. Something shifted in the terminal air, a low, dangerous frequency humming beneath the fluorescent lights, as Mr. Sterling turned his back on Irina. Not a retreat, a dismissal, the kind that lands like an open palm. Irina sat motionless for one long heartbeat, her hands pressed against the carbon fiber rims of her wheels, fingers trembling. Not from fear, from something older, hotter. Injustice calcified over years of navigating a world that hadn't been built with her in mind. Around her now stood a wall of expensive leather luggage, a barricade made of vanity and entitlement. She drew a breath. When she spoke again, her voice had shrunk, but it had also sharpened into something fine and piercing, like a needle. Sir, I am asking you one last time to respect the regulations of this airport. You are obstructing a person with a disability, and you are creating a safety hazard. This isn't just about a seat, it's about the law. Mr. Sterling stopped mid-stride. He didn't turn right away. He released a long, theatrical sigh, the kind that made both his sons smirk. Only then did he pivot back toward her. The polished mask of the successful businessman had cracked apart entirely. What remained was something raw and petty. The twisted fury of a man who had never heard the word no from someone he considered beneath him. He didn't see a human being in that chair. He saw a malfunction in his flawless day, a glitch to be erased. And he didn't address Irina at all. Instead, his gaze drifted over his shoulder toward the shadows near the boarding gate, toward a figure who had gone unnoticed by the general crowd, but who had been on Mason's radar from the moment he stepped into the terminal. The man's name was Miller. He moved into the light, a mountain in human form, 35 maybe, neck thick as a tree trunk. buzz cut so severe it looked capable of drawing blood. A black tactical polo stretched across a massive chest. Khaki trousers concealed the reinforced boots underneath. His eyes were flat, empty of empathy. The gaze of someone compensated not to think, only to act. Miller was the Sterling's private security, a human shield for their arrogance. He walked with a heavy, thudding stride that parted the crowded aisle without a single word. "Miller," Mr. Sterling said. His voice had gone cold, dangerously quiet. "This lady is having some difficulty understanding the concept of sharing. She's being very disruptive. Clear the area. I want my family to have some peace before we board." Vague enough for legal cover, clear enough in intent. Miller didn't pause, didn't ask Arena to relocate, didn't extend a hand in assistance. He simply stepped forward, and his enormous frame swallowed the light from the terminal windows. Arena looked up at him, eyes wide, breath catching hard in her throat. She tried to reverse the wheelchair, but the Sterling's bags rose like a wall behind her, pinning her into the corner of the seating row. The passengers nearby finally understood. The verbal confrontation was tipping towards something far darker. A woman gasped, pulling her child close. She did not step forward. A man in a business suit glanced up from his laptop, frowned, and immediately looked back down. He chose the safety of his screen over the reality unfolding 6 feet from his seat. Miller extended one massive, calloused hand. He didn't reach for Arena. He reached for the armrest of the wheelchair. His thick fingers sank into the padding. "Quote 20 quote," he grunted. His voice sounded like gravel being ground to dust. "Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore, underscore." What came next was violent and sudden. He didn't merely pull the chair, he lifted one side and shoved, a movement born of pure, gratuitous cruelty, designed to humiliate as much as to remove. The physics were merciless. That lightweight, precision-balanced wheelchair was never engineered to absorb lateral force of that magnitude. It tipped instantly. Arena released a short, sharp cry, surprise severed mid-breath as her body pitched sideways. Below her waist, she had no sensation, no control, no way to brace her legs or catch her own weight. She was a passenger inside her own fall. Her shoulders struck the hard, unforgiving linoleum first. Then came the sickening thud of her hip. The wheelchair, suddenly weightless, skittered and spun across the tile. Its wheels whirred against nothing. An overturned insect, legs churning at empty air. Arena lay where she'd landed, cream cardigan twisted beneath her, her book flung several feet away with pages shivering under the air conditioning. The sound of impact was something worse than loud. It was the sound of a human being broken open in front of strangers. For a handful of seconds, Terminal 4 held its breath. The fluorescent hum overhead swelled to fill the vacuum. The Sterling sons stood frozen, faces blank with momentary surprise. Mrs. Sterling tugged at her silk wrap and turned her gaze elsewhere, as though a woman crumpled on the ground was simply an unpleasant breach of decorum, beneath acknowledgement. Mr. Sterling made no move toward her. He glanced at Miller, a curt nod. Approval, clean and cold. Mr. Sterling said, "No remorse in the word, none near it." Arena didn't stir. One cheek pressed to cold tile that reeked of industrial wax and 1,000 passing shoes. Her hair had slipped its clip, fallen across her face in dark ribbons. She wasn't crying, not yet. Her mind was still trying to close around the fact, in a room full of witnesses, in daylight, in a modern American terminal, she had been thrown away like something broken. Pain bloomed from her shoulder now, dull, deep, the kind that whispers dislocation or worse. But the silence of the crowd cut deeper than bone. 40-some people within arm's reach, every face a portrait of frozen cowardice. Bystander paralysis, painted across an entire gate lounge. That silence did not hold. Something shattered it from the far corner. Not a human sound, a growl, low, chest-deep, vibrational. The kind of sound that begins in the ribcage of a predator and moves through open air like a promise made to no one in particular. Atlas was on his feet. Front paws spread wide, head dropped low. Upper lip peeled back to expose teeth designed to shred tactical-grade equipment. The fur along his spine stood in a serrated ridge, and his gaze locked onto Miller with a focus that was absolute, unwavering, predatory. Mason rose beside him. But this was not the man who'd been sagging against a concrete pillar minutes before. Something had shifted at his core. Exhaustion gone. In its place, the cold, diamond-clear awareness of a SEAL who has just classified a threat. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't swear. He moved with a silence that was itself a weapon, stepping over his own bag, crossing toward the center of the lounge. Each stride carried the weight of what was coming. The temperature around him seemed to drop, and the same passengers who'd been staring at their shoes a moment ago now couldn't look away from the man in the gray t-shirt and the black dog at his side. Miller heard the growl. He turned. His chest swelled as he watched Mason close the distance. Knuckles cracked, slow, deliberate. A grin spread across his jaw. He saw a smaller man, a leashed dog, and he assumed he was still the most dangerous presence in the room. He had no concept that the clock on his arrogance had already run out. In the next 8 seconds, everyone in that terminal would learn the distance between a bully collecting a paycheck and a warrior with a reason to move. The shift from stillness to violence was not gradual. For Mason, it was binary, a switch thrown at the molecular level. Those 8 seconds didn't begin when he reached the Sterlings. They began the instant his boot left the linoleum near his pillar. To the frozen witnesses of Terminal 4, Mason became a smear of gray and shadow, a professional predator cutting through a flock of startled civilians. He did not run. Running was wasteful, amateur. He moved low instead, center of gravity locked and fluid, covering 15 feet before Miller's smirk had time to settle on his face. Miller registered the dog first. Atlas, 90 pounds of fur and trained muscle, launched on an unspoken command that traveled through the leash like a current. The German Shepherd did not bark. Barking was a warning. And the moment Arena hit that floor, warnings had expired. Atlas launched himself from 3 feet out, his body stretching through the air like a guided missile made of muscle and bone. He didn't snap at the throat. Didn't go for an arm or a leg. This was a Tier 1 military working dog, trained for non-lethal takedowns in volatile situations. Atlas drove his full body weight into the center of Miller's chest, a blunt force collision that landed like a loaded sandbag, slamming into a brick wall. Miller, all that gym-sculpted bulk and borrowed confidence, never had a chance to brace. The air ripped out of his lungs in a strangled wheeze as the dog's momentum drove them both into the floor. Atlas locked him down instantly, front paws pinning the man's shoulders, snout hovering inches from his eyes. A low, rolling growl pressing down on him like a physical force, raw, ancient terror that turned every muscle in the bodyguard's body to stone. At the same moment, Mason closed the distance to Mr. Sterling. The businessman watched his hired protection crumble in under a second, and for the first time, real fear cracked through that polished shell of entitlement. He did what cornered bullies always do. He lashed out, swinging his heavy leather briefcase at Mason's head in a wild, graceless arc. Mason didn't flinch, didn't sidestep. He walked straight into the swing, his left hand rising to intercept Sterling's forearm, while his right found the pressure point behind the jaw. Surgical, deliberate. One subtle rotation of the wrist, a slight shift in weight. Sterling's own force turned against him. The briefcase hit the floor with a clatter, and the patriarch of the Sterling family found himself spun, arm wrenched behind his back in a locked chicken wing that drove him to his knees, right beside the woman he'd just ordered thrown aside. The two Sterling sons lurched forward to help. Mason's gaze stopped them cold. He glanced over his shoulder, and those eyes, empty of warmth, empty of anything recognizably soft, froze both boys mid-step. 19 and 20 years old, products of elite private schools and a lifetime without consequences. They had never stood in front of a man who could take them apart without raising his pulse. They stayed exactly where they were, hands half raised, twin monuments to cowardice. The entire sequence, Mason's first step to both men flat on the ground, lasted 8 seconds. In the stillness that followed, the terminal held its breath. The only sounds were the scrape of Arena's overturned wheelchair and the distant chime of a boarding call echoing from another gate. Mason kept his grip locked on Sterling. When he spoke, his voice came out low, a dangerous rasp barely above a whisper. "The lady asked you to move your bags," Mason said. No heat in his tone, no anger. That absence made it worse. Far worse. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone stating a natural law. "You chose to hurt her instead. That was a tactical error." He added a fraction more pressure to the lock. Sterling let out a choked whimper, his face darkening to a mottled purple against the terminal's gray light. Irina was still on the ground, propped on one elbow, hair tangled, face drained of color. But her eyes. Her eyes were sharp, cataloging everything. The way Atlas held the bodyguard pinned, ears flat back, focus absolute. The working dog vest. The controlled, precise violence of Mason's movements. It clicked then. This wasn't some passing stranger playing hero. This was a professional, operating at a level of discipline she'd only encountered in classified documents. The silence broke apart under the heavy, rhythmic slam of combat boots and the clatter of metal. "Security, everyone stay where you are." Officer Vance, tall, rigid, zero patience in his voice, strode into the priority zone in a dark blue airport security uniform. 3 officers flanked him, hands resting on their holsters. Their eyes swept the scene. A man forced to his knees, a bodyguard pinned beneath a dog. A woman sprawled on the floor. To anyone walking in fresh, the picture told the wrong story entirely. They hadn't seen the shove. All they saw was the aftermath. A well-dressed family being held down by a man who looked like he'd just stepped off a battlefield. "Drop the man. Call off the dog now." Vance barked the order, taser drawn and aimed square at Mason's chest. The other officers fanned out to cover the flanks, faces tight. Passengers nearby felt the shift. Authority had landed, and a low murmur rippled through the crowd. The Sterlings recognized their moment. They flipped the entire narrative in seconds. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 28, underscore, underscore. Mrs. Sterling screamed, her voice pitched high enough to crack crystal. She threw herself toward the officers, one trembling finger thrust at Mason. Mr. Sterling seized the opening. His moans grew louder, pain theatrically amplified. He tilted his face up toward Officer Vance, pure manufactured agony. Miller, still locked under Atlas, hadn't shifted an inch. But his voice joined the chorus. "He's armed. I saw a blade. The dog's out of control." A coordinated deception, a perimeter of lies engineered to bury the truth beneath an avalanche of urgent accusations. The 2 sons piled on, voices tangling together in a breathless refrain. "He hit us first. He's dangerous." Officer Vance fixed Mason with a hard stare. "Sir, I will not ask again. Release him and control the dog, or we will use force." Mason did not panic. He registered the taser aimed at his heart, the officers flanking him, Irina on the ground below. He saw how they were reading him, the tactical cap, the muscular frame, the aggressive shepherd, and understood precisely where this was heading. In the eyes of the law right now, he was the aggressor. Slowly, with absolute deliberation, he released Mr. Sterling's arm. Stepped back, raised both hands, palms open. Compliance as controlled as the strike that preceded it. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 35, underscore, underscore. The command was iron. The German shepherd disengaged instantly, retreating with one last warning snap before settling at Mason's left side. Perfectly still, eyes locked on the threat. Military discipline restored in a single breath. Miller clawed his way upright, sucking air. Mr. Sterling lingered on the floor a beat longer, making sure every officer got a good look at his injuries. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Vance ordered. A younger officer, also named Miller, no connection to the bodyguard, stepped forward with cuffs. "Officer, wait!" Irina fought to push her voice above the Sterling's noise. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 38, underscore, underscore. But Mrs. Sterling had already positioned herself at Vance's shoulder, her expensive perfume cutting through the charged air. "Ignore her. She's probably working with him. You saw what that animal did. It's a public menace. My husband needs medical attention. We are pressing charges. Maximum penalty." The handcuffs closed around Mason's wrists. cold metal, familiar, unwelcome weight. He offered no protest, no explanation. He understood that in a contest of credibility between a man in a gray t-shirt and a family with a private attorney on speed dial, truth was always the first thing to die. As they walked him away, he glanced back at Irina. A flight attendant was helping her to her feet. Her eyes held two things at once: gratitude and horror, as she watched the man who had saved her marched off like a criminal. The Sterlings were already clustered together, whispering, pointing, fear draining from their faces, replaced by that smug, untouchable certainty that only extreme wealth can buy. The battle inside the terminal is finished, but the war for Mason's freedom and Atlas's survival was only beginning. That metallic click of the cuffs was a sound Mason knew intimately. Though usually he stood on the other side of them, fastening steel around high-value targets in the dark corners of the world. Now the cold bite pressed into his own wrists. A brutal reminder. On home soil, his specialized training was not a shield. It was a liability. As Officer Vance cranked the ratchets tight, the sound sliced through the hushed terminal like a rifle report, sealing the chapter of raw violence and opening the slow, suffocating machinery of bureaucratic erasure. Mason held himself rigid, eyes locked on some fixed point past the horizon. His face betrayed nothing, carved granite, while the Sterlings launched their choreographed spectacle for the swelling crowd of gawkers in uniforms. The walk through Terminal 4 was surgical in its cruelty, not a protector being escorted, a threat being contained. 3 armed officers flanked him at careful distance, bodies angled like men bracing for detonation. And the travelers, those same travelers who'd stood mute and paralyzed while Irina was shoved, suddenly discovered their courage. They whispered, they pointed, faces pinched with the cheap certainty of people standing behind a police line. Fragments of their talk reached him. Animal, thug, terrorist. The words hung in the recycled terminal air like something poisonous. This was the first barb of his new reality, a question lodged in every witness's skull. How does a man who carries himself like a hero become a monster? But the real wound came at the terminal exit. A white animal control van sat waiting, orange lights pulsing, clinical, hungry. 2 handlers in thick, bite-proof canvas moved toward Atlas. The German shepherd felt it coming, and he made a sound Mason had heard only once before, during a midnight extraction in a desert wasteland. Low, mournful, a frequency that lived somewhere beneath language, beneath training, pure, marrow-deep dread. Atlas didn't snap, didn't bare his teeth. His discipline ran too deep for that. He simply turned his amber eyes toward Mason, searching for a command that could explain this, waiting for an order that would restore the world to sense. Quote, 43, Irina called out, her voice fracturing as she fought to wheel her damaged chair toward the van. A flight attendant blocked her path. Safety regulations. Quote, 44, Nobody listened. The handlers looped a catch pole around Atlas's neck, the heavy wire cinching tight, an indignity that made Mason's jaw lock until bone ground against bone. They didn't see a decorated combat veteran. They saw 90 pounds of liability with teeth. They forced Atlas into a cramped, metal-reinforced kennel, slammed the door shut. That sound, metal meeting metal, was the sound of severance, a tactical dislocation that left Mason more exposed than any firefight ever had. While Mason sat in the windowless, fluorescent-soaked basement of the airport police station being processed, the Sterling family occupied a private lounge upstairs. Richard Sterling reclined on soft leather, ice bag draped across his shoulder, premium mineral water sweating in his hand. He wasn't speaking to police, he was speaking to Henderson. His lawyer had materialized with impossible speed, briefcase loaded with legal precedent and quiet menace. Quote, 45, Henderson murmured. His voice carried no friction, no moral weight whatsoever. Quote, 46, Outside that lounge, Officer Vance was attempting to collect Irina's statement. She sat in her chair, shoulders screaming with a pain she refused to let surface. Her eyes burned, cold, precise, dissecting. She gave her account with surgical calm. The shove, the verbal assault, the way the Sterlings had cornered her. She described Mason's intervention as controlled, proportional, a measured response to an active physical attack. Vance listened. His pen hovered above the notepad, but his gaze kept sliding toward the private lounge, where the local chief of police was, at that very moment, clasping Richard Sterling's hand. The pressure was soundless and total. Sterling wasn't some inconvenienced passenger. He was a major donor to the city's political machinery. A man who could dismantle a cop's career with one phone call, Vance said, dropping his voice. Irina fired back, her voice bouncing off the sterile corridor walls. Vance said, a lie, his eyes dropping to the floor. By the time Mason reached the holding cell at county jail, the narrative was already sealed. Local news aired a segment, quote, _55, _____. A grainy shot of Mason in handcuffs. A crisp, high-definition interview with Mrs. Sterling, tears streaking her cheeks, describing the horror of being stalked by a wild animal. Not one word about the priority seating zone. Not one mention of Irina. The truth had been surgically removed. In its place, a polished fiction that shielded the powerful and condemned the protector. Mason sat on the edge of the hard plastic cot in his cell. Silence pressed down on him, thick and airless, letting old ghosts murmur from the dark corners. He pictured Atlas in a cold concrete kennel, confused, alone. He wondered about Irina, whether someone had helped her back into her chair, whether she'd found her book. Pride and bitterness tangled inside him. He had done what was right, and in the country he'd bled for, doing what was right often carried the steepest price. The Sterlings would come for him, he knew that. They'd use their money to purchase witnesses, to lean on the prosecution. The machine was already calibrated to grind him down, all to preserve the comfort of the wealthy. But sitting there, staring at the reinforced steel door, Mason did not feel like a victim. He felt like a man behind enemy lines, patient, calculating, waiting for his moment. The Sterlings believed they had won because they held the police and the press. What they failed to grasp, they had just provoked a man trained to prevail against impossible odds. And a woman who read the world in data patterns no attorney could bury. The stakes were planted, the tension drawn taut, and the real fight was only now beginning to surface. The interview room at county jail was a lesson in engineered suffocation. Walls painted a shade of gray that seemed built to leach the color from a person's soul. A single fluorescent tube overhead, humming at a frequency that burrowed into Mason's skull and stayed there. No window. A heavy steel door with a sliding slit. A cold table bolted to the floor, flanked by two mismatched chairs. Mason occupied one of them, hands uncuffed now, but his spine locked straight. A reflex of discipline that no cage could soften. 3 hours he'd been in this room, ignored by guards, left with silence and the expanding weight of everything unknown. He wasn't turning over the charges in his mind, not the legal fees. He was seeing Atlas's tail tucked tight between his legs as they forced him into that van. He was seeing the look in the dog's eyes, pure betrayal. The steel door groaned open, and in walked a man who appeared to have been engineered specifically for predatory litigation. Elias Thorne, senior associate at the firm representing the Sterling family, late 40s, salt and pepper hair slicked back so tight it resembled a helmet, a charcoal suit cut with mathematical precision, a silk tie the shade of dried blood. Nothing about him belonged in a jail. He belonged on a yacht, in a boardroom, deciding the futures of thousands with a signature. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a sense of entitlement so dense it seemed to push the oxygen from the room. He did not sit right away. First, he produced a spotless white handkerchief, wiped the seat of the empty chair, then lowered himself with careful, rehearsed elegance. "Mr. Callahan," Thorne said. His voice was polished, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd never needed to raise it. "My name is Elias Thorne. I represent the Sterling family. I'm here because my clients are, and this may surprise you, genuinely compassionate people. They recognize your service to this country. They understand that a man who has witnessed what you've witnessed, sometimes that damage surfaces in regrettable ways. They have no desire to watch a Navy SEAL's entire life collapse over one impulsive afternoon in an airport. Let me lay out your reality. You're staring down multiple felony assault charges. You deployed a trained animal as a weapon. You caused permanent, debilitating injury to a credentialed security professional. The district attorney is already building toward a 5-year minimum, particularly given who your alleged victims are. But the Sterlings are prepared to make this disappear. Every charge dismissed. Your service record untouched. You leave this building tonight. Mason spoke for the first time low, dry as sand. What's the cost? Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 60, underscore, underscore. No cost, Mr. Callahan. A resolution. This is a prepared statement. You acknowledge a momentary lapse caused by post-traumatic stress. You confirm the Sterlings exhibited no aggression, that you misread the situation entirely. You issue a full public apology for your conduct and for your dog's unprovoked attack. And you consent to a voluntary medical discharge from the Navy. In return, the Sterlings withdraw everything. Clean, complete, you go home, find a quiet life. We all move forward. Mason didn't glance at the paper. You're asking me to lie, to stand in front of the world and say Arena wasn't shoved, that your clients weren't predators, that I'm some broken wreck who lost control. You want me to trade my honor for my freedom. Thorne leaned in, the sharp musk of his cologne colliding with the bleach-scrubbed air. Honor is an expensive luxury, Mason, and right now, you can't afford it. But if your own future doesn't move you, maybe the dog's will, your German shepherd, Atlas. Because he attacked a civilian and inflicted serious harm, he's been classified as a Tier 4 dangerous animal. Under city ordinance, that designation carries a mandatory euthanasia order. He's being held right now in a high-security kennel at the municipal shelter. Sign this agreement and the Sterlings will leverage their connections to reclassify the incident. A training error. The dog gets released to a private property, lives out his remaining years in peace, but if you refuse, quote 65. If you take this to trial, that dog will be put down before the first witness takes the stand. We will see to it personally. You think you've won, Mason said. His voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it landed like a killing blow. You think your money and your lawyers can rewrite what happened in that terminal? But you're overlooking one thing. You're not sitting across from a civilian. You're sitting across from a SEAL. We don't negotiate with people like you. Thorne's smile died. In its place, a cold, bare sneer. He rose, snapping the portfolio closed, the sound sharp as a bone breaking. Very well. Have it your way, Mr. Callahan. You want to play the martyr? Fine. But understand something. By the time he was finished, the public wouldn't see a hero. They'd see a volatile, broken veteran who unleashed a beast on a family. And the dog. Thorne would personally ensure the injection happened tomorrow morning. Mason had a chance to save him. He chose pride instead. Thorne signaled the guard. The door opened. He walked out without a backward glance, expensive shoes striking linoleum with the arrogance of every step. Mason sat alone in the gray room. The fluorescent light hummed louder than before. He stared at the empty chair where the lawyer had been. For one raw, unguarded second, agony tore through him, pure and total. He'd refused the deal, but the price of that refusal was a nightmare he wasn't certain he could endure. He shut his eyes. Atlas's face found him in the dark, and there, in that cell, Mason swore something to himself. He wouldn't merely fight for his own survival. He would dismantle the Sterling's fortress of lies, brick by brick, until nothing remained but naked truth. He just prayed Arena was doing the same. The courtroom smelled of old mahogany and industrial disinfectant. Cold institutional judgment hung in the air, sharpened by the sterile buzz of overhead lights. Jennifer Hartley, 20 years of trial work behind her, a face like a whetstone, stood before the jury with the kind of authority that makes defense lawyers swallow hard. She didn't see Mason as a man who'd served this country. She saw a piece of evidence to be taken apart. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice low, rhythmic, built for condemnation. This case concerns unprovoked, excessive violence committed by the defendant against unarmed civilians. Every syllable carried certainty that left zero room for nuance. She painted a portrait of a man trained as a weapon, a man who had forgotten the battlefield was behind him. His tactical expertise wasn't framed as service. It was framed as a dangerous skill turned against a family simply trying to enjoy their afternoon. Richard Sterling sat in the second row, tailored suit, medical sling that looked more expensive than any real bandage. He radiated the untouchable calm of a man who'd already purchased today's outcome before the first word left anyone's mouth. Mrs. Sterling sat beside him, pressing a silk handkerchief to her eyes at careful intervals. A performance staged for the local reporters who'd been quietly informed about the violent veteran. 12 ordinary citizens watched from the jury box, eyes wide, as Hartley described a vicious animal that had savagely mauled a professional security guard. By focusing on injuries and fear, she steered attention exactly where she needed it, toward questions about Mason's stability. She avoided drowning the jury in detail. Instead, she pulled them into the supposed trauma of the Sterling family, invested them in it. When Richard Sterling took the stand, his transformation into a victim was seamless. His voice dropped low, trembled. He spoke of wanting to protect his sons, of the shock he felt when he was viciously attacked by the defendant. "I was just trying to help my family find somewhere to sit," he lied, his gaze locked on the jury foreman with manufactured sincerity. "And then this man just lost control. He set his dog on us. I thought my son was going to die." He limped faintly on his way back to his seat, a detail unsupported by any medical record, but perfect for courtroom theater. Miller followed. His testimony described Atlas as a bloodthirsty creature trained to kill, carefully leaving out the fact that the dog hadn't even broken his skin. Mason the hero, Mason the threat. The two ideas collided in that room with an almost physical force. Mason's public defender, Marcus Chun, stood to cross-examine. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with a toothpick. Marcus was 31. His caseload was humanly impossible, and whatever idealism he'd carried into this profession was eroding fast under the weight of the Sterling family's reach. Every attempt he made to reference the priority seating sign or the fact that Arena had been shoved, Hartley rose with an objection. Judge Hendricks sustained nearly all of them. Judge Hendricks had spent 18 years on the bench. She understood what the Sterling name meant in this county. The defense looked scattered, outmatched, pointless. Mason sat at that table with his hands locked together, his face forged into something unreadable. Lies stacked around him like sandbags, and he didn't flinch. The afternoon's breaking point arrived when Hartley delivered her closing request for the session. "Your Honor, the defendant is a trained killer. He has demonstrated an inability to re-enter civilian life without falling back on the violence the military drilled into him. Given the permanent psychological and physical harm he has inflicted, the state seeks the maximum prison sentence." She paused. Her gaze drifted to the empty space beside Mason, the space where Atlas should have been sitting. Furthermore, the animal involved has proven itself a public safety threat beyond rehabilitation. We request a court order for its immediate destruction. That word, destruction, landed like a sledgehammer on stone. And for the first time, Mason's mask slipped. Not a sound, not a movement. Just a tightening of the jaw so fierce the gallery could see it. This wasn't about his freedom anymore. This was about the life of the only partner who had never walked away. Arena watched from the back row, her damaged wheelchair angled into the aisle, her expression giving nothing. The Sterling's legal machinery had silenced her. A procedural error Henderson had engineered kept her off the witness stand. But as Hartley settled into her chair, radiating certainty, Arena's hand drifted to the small encrypted tablet on her lap. She wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair. She was a woman with access to data that Sterling money couldn't touch. She watched Judge Hendricks prepare to adjourn. A thin, razor-edged smile crossed her lips. The Sterlings believed they held a monopoly on power. They were about to learn what happens when you corner a Navy SEAL and a Pentagon analyst. The question hung in that courtroom like smoke. What would unfold when truth finally punched through the wall of money? The atmosphere inside that room changed the instant Marcus Chun called his final witness. Up to this moment, the prosecution had successfully shaped everything into a clean, simple story. Violent veteran, dangerous dog. A narrative tailored to jury bias and a powerful family's interests. But as Irina wheeled herself toward the front, something else moved with her. A stillness. Cold. Deliberate. The kind that makes people stop breathing and start thinking. She didn't resemble the victim the Sterlings had tried to erase. She looked like the architect of something they hadn't prepared for. Richard Sterling shifted in his seat. For the first time, his confidence wavered, watching the woman he had physically cast aside position herself to speak. Jennifer Hartley was already standing before Irina reached the witness box. Your Honor, I must object. Ms. Ramirez was excluded from the witness list due to procedural delays. Her testimony is irrelevant at this stage. Marcus Chun held his ground. He stood with a posture that had finally found its backbone, eyes locked on the judge with surgical precision. Your Honor, the witness's identity and the evidence in her possession were classified under national security protocols. Those restrictions were lifted exactly 10 minutes ago. This is not simply a witness. This is a revelation that strikes at the very core of what's true. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her gaze narrowing on Irina. State your name and occupation for the record. Irina adjusted the microphone. Her voice carried through that wood-paneled room with the clarity of a struck bell. My name is Dr. Irina Vance. I am a senior intelligence analyst with the Department of Defense, currently stationed at the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Dr. Vance, the prosecution has claimed the airport security footage was inconclusive. Can you explain why? Because the airport security system is managed by a private contractor with ties to the Sterling Group. They provided a sanitized version of events. However, Terminal 4 also contains several high-definition encrypted government nodes, used for facial recognition and threat detection by the TSA and the DoD. These nodes are not accessible to local police or private lawyers. Quote, _83 _. This drive holds the raw, unedited feed from the government node directly above the priority seating area. It captures the entire incident in 4K resolution, including audio. Quote, _84 _. The defendant acted with the restraint and precision expected of an active-duty Navy SEAL. The only criminals in that terminal were the men currently sitting in the second row. Your Honor, I am here to provide immediate character testimony for Chief Petty Officer Mason Callahan. Furthermore, I am here to inform the court that the Department of the Navy has taken an official interest in this case. We do not take lightly the false imprisonment and defamation of our elite operators, nor the attempted destruction of a decorated military working dog. Commander Grant, please take the stand. Chief Petty Officer Mason Callahan is not simply an operator under my command. Quote, 90. He is the benchmark by which we define the word protector. 13 years he has served in the darkest corners of this world. 13 years ensuring that families like the Sterlings sleep undisturbed in their fine beds, never once learning the names of the men who guard their peace. His training is not built for aggression. It is engineered for surgical restraint. What that footage shows is not an assault. It is the most disciplined application of military training to a civilian emergency I have ever witnessed. Quote, _91 _. The Department of the Navy conducted its own internal review of the incident at Terminal 4. Chief Callahan adhered to every protocol of engagement. He identified a vulnerable non-combatant under attack by a superior force. He neutralized that force using the absolute minimum physical intervention necessary. To prosecute this man is to dishonor the uniform he wears, and to attempt the destruction of his working dog, a canine who pulled a dozen men out of death and Marger, is a moral disgrace this office refuses to let stand. Your Honor, regardless of the witness's credentials, the fact remains that physical injuries were sustained. Judge Hendricks didn't wait for the sentence to end. Sit down, Miss Hartley. The words fell like a blade through the courtroom air. I have seen enough. The evidence presented by Dr. Vance is beyond dispute. The testimony of Commander Grant is conclusive. This court was handed a story of violence, a story that has been exposed as deliberate fiction, constructed to shield the pride of individuals who believe themselves untouchable by law. Her gaze swept the jury box. They were nodding together, faces carrying equal parts shame and quiet outrage. In the matter of the state versus Mason Callahan, Judge Hendricks declared, her gavel raised high, all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Chief Callahan, you are free to go. Additionally, this court issues an immediate emergency stay on the euthanasia order for K9 Atlas. He is to be returned to the custody of the Navy SEALs immediately. The gavel came down hard, a crack that split the room like thunder. The sterling empire of lies collapsed in a single stroke. No one cheered. 47 Marines and the SEAL team rose as one body, silent, spines straight, chins lifted. A tribute deeper than any applause could carry, but justice had not finished its work. Judge Hendricks shifted her gaze to the second row. Mr. Richard Sterling, Mr. Miller, and the young men involved, you will remain in this courtroom. Based on the video evidence submitted by Dr. Vance, I am referring this matter to the district attorney. Immediate investigation into felony assault, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Officers, take them into custody for processing. The ground beneath the Sterlings gave way in an instant. Two bailiffs, the same ones who days earlier had led Mason in handcuffs, now crossed the floor toward the Sterling family. Richard Sterling's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. A man drowning in air. His sons stood frozen, designer clothes hanging off them like costumes from a game they never should have played. Miller, the bodyguard, dropped his head without resistance. Metal clicked around his wrists. They were escorted through the side door, the very same door Mason had been dragged through days before. The courtroom held its silence like a breath finally released. 10 minutes passed, then that side door opened again, and a familiar sound filled the air, rhythmic panting, claws on tile. Atlas, freed from his concrete cage at the animal shelter, burst into the room. No bark, just a sable blur streaking across the floor. He didn't stop until his front paws hit Mason's chest, his head pressing deep into the man's neck. Mason, the same man who had faced mortar fire and shrapnel without flinching, dropped to his knees. He wrapped his arms around the dog and held on, eyes closed, feeling that steady, familiar heartbeat against his own. Arena watched from her chair, tears slipping down her face as warrior and dog became whole again. When Mason and Arena finally made their way toward the courthouse exit, they found the steps covered in dress uniforms. The sun hung low, throwing long golden light across the stone pillars. Commander Grant and the SEAL team had formed a corridor of honor. Mason pushed Arena's wheelchair through the center. Every man in uniform raised a slow, deliberate hand to his brow. That salute was not only for a chief petty officer. It was for the woman who had used her mind to rescue one of their own. Mason stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up, the cold weight he'd carried for weeks, finally lifting. He glanced down at Arena, who reached up and wrapped her fingers around his hand. "Where to now, Chief?" she asked, a quiet smile on her face. Mason looked at Atlas, sitting tall beside him, then back at the woman who had changed everything. "Home," he said, voice steady, clear. "We're going home." They moved forward together, the courthouse darkness falling away behind them, a future opening ahead where honor wasn't a burden anymore. It was a shield. The story of Mason, Arena, and Atlas carries a truth worth remembering. Real strength has nothing to do with the size of a bank account or the volume of a voice. It lives in the willingness to stand for those who cannot stand alone. In a world where money and influence try to rewrite what actually happened, honor, integrity, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his loyal dog will always burn brighter than the darkest lie. Privilege may try to crush the innocent, but the courage of righteous people will eventually shatter every wall corruption can build. If this story reached something deep inside you, if it reminded you what sacrifice and justice truly mean, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and those you love with peace, steady strength, and the bravery to do what is right. Type Amen in the comments if you believe truth will always prevail. Thank you for being here. Sometimes all it takes is one quiet act of bravery, and somebody's entire life shifts. Hold on to that. Walk gently, walk strong, and we'll meet again soon.